Just minutes after takeoff from London Heathrow, a Boeing 737 carrying 126 passengers and crew is in serious trouble. The aircraft has begun to shake violently, and a sickening smell of burning has filled the air. Orange flashes light up the passenger cabin as one of the engines begins tearing itself to pieces. The pilots shut down an engine and begin limping their crippled jet back to the airport. But then, at the last minute, the captain has a horrifying realisation. They have shut down the wrong engine. How did such an experienced crew make such a basic mistake, and would they be able to fix it before time ran out? This is the story of British Midlands Flight 92. It was a cold January evening in 1989, as 118 passengers and 8 crew boarded a brand new Boeing 737-400 at London's Heathrow Airport. They were bound for Belfast in Northern Ireland, a short 1-hour journey. Many of the passengers were business travellers, returning home to Belfast after a trip to London, while others were families visiting loved ones in Belfast, and tourists returning home from the UK's capital. There were also 5 cabin crew on board, and 2 pilots. In command of the flight was 43-year-old Captain Kevin Hunt. Hunt was one of British Midlands' most experienced pilots, having joined the airline 22 years previously in 1966 at the age of 20. He had flown a wide range of aircraft in that time, and had built up an impressive 13,000 hours of flying experience. On this evening though, certain parts of this experience would end up being not a blessing, but a curse. Sitting to Hunt's right was 39-year-old First Officer David McClelland. McClelland had just over 3,000 hours of experience, most of which were on smaller propeller-driven aircraft. He had joined British Midlands the previous year, when he had been signed off to fly the 737. In this time, he had built up just short of 200 hours on it. Neither pilot was a total stranger to the Boeing 737, having amassed almost 1,000 hours on the aircraft between them. But they were new to this particular variant of the 737, the 400 series, which had just been introduced the previous year. The new plane had an upgraded cockpit, with modern CRT displays replacing the older analog gauges of the past. This was Boeing's response to the emerging threat that was Airbus, which just that year had released its ultra-modern A320 as a direct competitor to the 737. According to Boeing, the pilots' lack of experience on this new aircraft shouldn't have posed any problems. In what could be described as a signature move from the company, they had convinced regulators and airlines that pilots with previous 737 experience didn't need any advanced training like simulator time to fly the new 737. All they required was a few hours in the classroom and a pamphlet before they would be ready to sit behind the controls of Boeing's newest addition to its product line. This reduced need for training saved airlines millions, and it saved Boeing even more in both time and certification costs. By comparison, for an airline to buy Airbus's latest offering, it would have to send its pilots to the classroom and to a full-motion flight simulator for months on end, at a cost of around $1,000 per hour. The passengers of Flight 92 were now about to pay dearly for Boeing's tactical marketing decisions. That's because there was more to this new iteration of the 737 than met the eye. There had been some significant changes to the way in which information was presented to the pilots, and to some of the aircraft's key systems, such as its air conditioning and pressurization system. As the doors were sealed and the aircraft was pushed back from the gate at Heathrow, none of the passengers could have known that up front were 2 pilots who had never had the opportunity to practice any in-flight emergencies or procedures in a 737-400 simulator. First Officer McClelland taxied the brand new plane out to the runway at Heathrow, navigating the complex taxiway system while the captain carried out the pre-departure checks. Before we get to the runway, I want to say a quick word about today's sponsor, Opera. Opera's new web browser is really a breath of fresh air in what has become a pretty stagnant browser space. Unlike a lot of today's browsers, it's fast, feature-packed, and still easy to use. One of my favourite features of Opera is the Tab Islands feature. I find this really useful because as I browse the web, rather than cluttering the top of my browser with loads of tabs, I can just organise them into islands grouped by common themes. So here, I've got a tab island for some of the stuff I'm studying as part of my flight training. Here I've got a tab island for movies I'm trying to decide between watching, recommendations welcome by the way, and here I've got a tab island for my work on Green Dot Aviation. I can expand and contract these tabs as I want, which makes it so much easier to stay organised and productive. It's also great to know that with the built-in ad blocker and VPN, I can keep my data safe online with a single click. Opera also has its own browser AI, Aria. This is handy because whenever I have a question which Google can't answer, I just ask Aria. It gives detailed and helpful responses that actually make sense, and it's especially useful because it's integrated within the browser itself. Opera really feels like the future of the web. Everything I need is just there in the browser itself. Click my link in the video description to download Opera. It's free, it's fast, and it just works. Now, let's get back to the video. At 8 minutes to 8 that night, Flight 92 lined up on the runway and McClelland began the takeoff roll. For the first few minutes after takeoff, all was normal. The pilots accelerated and retracted the flaps and gear. They monitored their instruments as the plane climbed in autopilot, and all engine indications were normal. It was a typically busy evening for London's airspace, and the pilots initially had to level off at 6,000 feet. But before long, they were cleared to 12,000, and shortly thereafter up to their cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. The passengers settled in for the short trip, with some of them eating dinner, others reading, and others chatting amongst themselves. But this normality would be short-lived. Barely 15 minutes after takeoff, as it climbed through 28,300 feet, the plane began to shake violently. Overhead bins popped open, and drinks and personal items began sliding off passenger tray tables. Loud banging noises shook the aircraft, and intermittent flames from an engine lit up the passenger cabin. Then, a horrifying smell seeped into the cabin of burning oil, rubber, and hot metal. In the cockpit, the pilots immediately looked at their engine instruments. These next few seconds would be crucial. Hunt and McClelland would need all of their mental resources to quickly and accurately determine the source and nature of the problem, and to carry out the appropriate procedures to resolve it. But at this critical juncture, Captain Hunt made a split-second decision which would end up endangering the lives of everybody on board the aircraft. Rather than bringing his vast experience to bear on the problem he saw before him, he gave that job to the less experienced first officer and took over manual control of the aircraft himself. Now, the more experienced crew member was doing the relatively simple yet attention-consuming job of flying the plane manually, while the less experienced one was almost single-handedly responsible for diagnosing the urgent problem with the aircraft. As the first officer scanned the instruments, the captain was building a mental picture of the problem in his head. He had many hours on the previous generation of the 737, and he knew that on that aircraft, the forward cabin was fed air by the right-hand engine. Since he could smell burning, it made sense that the problem should be with the engine responsible for bringing air into the cabin, which, in his experience, was the right-hand engine. What neither pilot knew was that on the 737-400, the cabin air comes from both engines. So, in reality, the fact they smelled smoke told them nothing about which engine was having problems. But pilots don't make serious decisions like shutting down an engine based on their sense of smell. Thankfully, on this night, they had at their disposal some state-of-the-art instrumentation. The vibration meter for engine number 1, the left-hand engine, was indicating 5 units of vibration, the maximum that the instrument could display. The N1 indication, which showed the fan speed at the front of the engine, was fluctuating erratically. The exhaust gas temperature indicator was showing much higher values than normal, and the fuel flow readings were varying wildly. By contrast, all indications for the right-hand engine, engine number 2, were normal. The instruments were painting a very clear picture. The left-hand engine was having serious problems. But when Captain Hunt asked the first officer which engine was having issues, McClelland hesitated. In modern aircraft, the engine vibration meters are located on a screen. The left meter indicates the vibrations from the left engine, and the right meter from the right engine. This instrument is one of the most important indicators of any issue with the engines, and it's where McClelland was now focusing his attention. However, in the 737-400 engine layout, both engine vibration meters were located on the right-hand side of the engine instrument panel. In the stress of the moment, as the first officer quickly took in the instrument readings, he saw a high vibration reading coming from the right-hand side of the instrument panel. To make matters worse, in a cruel twist of irony, the very vibration whose source the pilots were trying to locate was so severe that it made it difficult for them to read the instruments. This effect was made worse by a phenomenon known as persistence of vision, where, in a dark environment, our eyes retain a trace of any light sources we look at for about a second. All of these effects swirled together into a perfect storm, such that when McClelland looked at his instruments, he hesitated before saying, It's the right one." Captain Hunt's suspicions were confirmed. He had already thought that it was the right-hand engine, given that he could smell smoke. He told McClelland to throttle the engine back. But the pilots were wrong. The engine instruments for the right-hand engine showed that it was working perfectly. It was the left engine that was tearing itself to pieces. This was something that the passengers and cabin crew were all too well aware of. They could see sparks and jets of flames shooting back from behind the left engine. They had no idea that up front in the cockpit, with all of their instrumentation, the pilots had missed this crucial fact. But just before the first officer throttled the engine back, there was one last clue that they had misidentified the problematic engine. and it was a big clue, staring them right in the face. In the 11 seconds since the captain had disengaged the autopilot and taken over from the first officer, the plane had begun a roll to the left. In that short time, it had actually reached a bank angle of 16 degrees, a pretty substantial departure from straight and level flight. The reason this was such a big clue is that the captain hadn't caused this turn, the engines had. With the fully functioning right-hand engine working at its normal power setting, and the sputtering left-hand engine producing much less thrust than normal, the aircraft had begun to be pushed to the left. This difference in thrust was giving a clear clue to the pilots that the problematic engine was the left-hand one. If it had been daytime, the pilots would clearly have been able to see this turn happening. But in the dark, with nothing to see out the windows, the only clue that they were turning came from the small artificial horizon in front of them. And they were so busy focusing on the engine instruments that they simply didn't notice this turn happening. When the captain finally did catch the aircraft, he didn't stop and think about why the plane had turned so much towards what he thought was the good engine. He simply leveled the wings and continued flying. But all of these missed clues were nothing compared to what would come next. Naturally, you would expect that as the first officer reduced power on the right-hand engine, the vibrations and the smell of smoke would remain, clearly showing that the left-hand engine was the problem. But that is not what happened here. That's because, as McClelland brought the right-hand engine lever back to idle, the captain reduced power on the left-hand engine too, in order to descend. And as the left engine was brought back to idle, the vibrations stopped, and the smell of smoke disappeared. The pilots had received a misleading vindication of their decision to throttle back the right-hand engine. As far as they were concerned, they had just executed a textbook identification and resolution of an in-flight emergency. The rest of the flight would consist of them finding an airport to divert to and informing the passengers of the disappointing news that they wouldn't be getting to their destination tonight. The reality was that when the pilots reduced power on both engines, the excess fuel which was igniting inside the left-hand engine, causing the noise and vibrations, had stopped coming into the engine. This is what had made the vibrations stop. It had nothing to do with reducing power on the fully functional right-hand engine. Despite this, there was still ample opportunity for the pilots to realise their mistake. Their instruments were still showing the true story, that all of their problems were with the left-hand engine. The first officer radioed London Air Traffic Control, telling them that they had an emergency situation which might be an engine fire. There were no cockpit indications that there was a fire, but realising that there might indeed be one, Captain Hunt then told McClelland to shut the engine down. But before the first officer did this, the captain took a look at the instruments and saw that the right engine was functioning normally. He then told the first officer to hold off on shutting down the engine for the moment. If Hunt had just checked the instruments a few centimetres to the left of the ones he was looking at, the truth would have been crystal clear. The next few minutes were busy, as the first officer coordinated the diversion with air traffic control, and the captain radioed the company to inform them of the situation. In the back, the cabin crew told the passengers to fasten their seatbelts. The worst of the shaking had stopped, but the passengers were still in the dark as to what was happening. Those sitting on the left-hand side of the plane could see a stream of jet fuel pouring out of the engine. But at least for now, the fire had stopped. After a few minutes, the pilots decided on East Midlands as their diversion airport. It was close to them, the runway was long enough, the weather was clear, and it was British Midlands' main engineering base. So, Flight 92 began setting course for East Midlands. As soon as he was off the radio, the first officer announced that he was about to start the engine failure and shutdown checklist for the right-hand engine. But just as he was about to start it, he checked the engine instruments. Of course, once again, engine 2 looked perfectly fine. He said, "Seems we've stabilised, we've still got the smoke." Again, he held off on the checklist, and the right engine remained at idle. But the pilot's window of opportunity to notice the clear discrepancy between the two engine indications would be brief. During a pause in the conversation between Captain Hunt and the airline's operations centre, the first officer finally closed the right-hand engine's fuel lever. Starved of fuel, the fully functioning right-hand engine began to wind down. McClelland then started the auxiliary power unit, which took on some of the electrical load the withering left-hand engine had to produce. Once the right-hand engine was shut down, the pilots noticed that the smoke smell had cleared from the flight deck. Again, this reinforced their belief that the right engine was causing the issue, and that they had done the correct thing by shutting it down. But there was still hope that the pilots might realise the error of their ways. In the back, there were 118 passengers and 6 cabin crew, many of whom had witnessed the engine problems firsthand. What better resource could a pilot ask for? The captain called the cabin supervisor up to the cockpit. Nowadays, in a similar situation, a captain would provide what is known as a NITS briefing to the cabin crew. N stands for the nature of the emergency, as in what has actually happened. It is at this point the captain would ask if the crew or passengers had seen anything that could help in understanding the type of emergency they were in. I stands for intention. In this case, the intention was to divert the aircraft to East Midlands. T stands for time, as in how long before the aircraft will be on the ground, and S stands for special or relevant information regarding the safety of those on board. This covers things like whether the passengers will need to remain in their seats on landing or if an evacuation will be required, and if so, whether all doors are available. But back in the 1980s and 1990s, this type of briefing had not yet been widely adopted. So, rather than doing a comprehensive brief, or even asking what specifically the cabin crew had noticed, Hunt simply asked the cabin crew supervisor whether he had seen smoke in the cabin. The supervisor said that he had, and then Hunt quickly instructed him to clear up the cabin and pack everything away. In failing to get more information from his crew, Hunt deprived himself of the opportunity to find out that many of the crew and passengers had seen nothing untoward with the right engine, but that they had seen plenty of evidence from the left-hand engine that it was not functioning correctly. The cabin supervisor headed back to the passengers and began preparing them for the diversion. Flight 92 was now being vectored by London Air Traffic Control towards East Midlands. It would be on the ground in less than 15 minutes. The captain was still flying manually and talking to East Midlands operations, while the first officer was dealing with air traffic control and with setting the aircraft up for its approach to the airport. It was a busy time in the cockpit, and the pilot's workload would only increase as they got closer. The passengers were growing increasingly concerned. They were clearly now descending, but the pilots had told them nothing about what was happening. What were they to think of all the flames and smoke and smells and vibration? The cabin supervisor contacted the captain, telling him that the passengers were beginning to panic. Hunt decided to make a PA. In that PA, he told the passengers that there had been an issue with the right-hand engine, which was responsible for producing the smoke they had seen in the cabin. He also said that the engine was now shut down, and that the aircraft would land at East Midlands Airport in around 10 minutes. This PA confused the passengers. Many of them had seen the flames coming from the left-hand engine. Why had the captain just said that he had shut down the right-hand engine? Perhaps he had misspoke, they thought. Or maybe there had been something wrong with the right engine too, that they just couldn't see out their windows. After all, it was the pilots who had access to all the instrumentation up in the cockpit. Surely they knew what they were doing. Even still, not one of the passengers made a comment to any of the cabin crew about what the captain had said, and the cabin crew too didn't question the captain's mention of the right-hand engine. Flight 92 continued its descent towards East Midlands, its left engine a ticking time bomb, hidden simply by the fact that it was operating at a low power setting during descent. As the flight neared East Midlands, the atmosphere in the cockpit was heavy, and the workload for both pilots was high. The first officer, in addition to handling all the radio calls and getting the latest weather, was also attempting to program the approach to runway 27 into the flight management system. In the heat of the moment, and still relatively new to the aircraft, he was having trouble doing this. After a few minutes of trying, McClelland abandoned his attempts at setting up the flight management computer. The pilots would simply need to follow air traffic control's instructions to make it to the airport. Finally, in a break between all of the communications with the ground, Captain Hunt decided to review the situation, saying, "Now, what indications did we actually get? Just rapid vibrations in the airplane, smoke?" This was the pilot's chance. Here they could carve out a few minutes to engage the autopilot, sit back and carefully work through the indications they had gotten and the actions they had taken before continuing their approach to the airport. They had plenty of fuel, and there was nothing forcing them to land immediately, given that they thought they were flying on a fully functioning engine. But just as they were about to begin this review of the situation, air traffic control interrupted them, handing them off to the next controller en route. After talking to the controller, rather than continuing the review of the situation, the first officer began to read the checklist for a one-engine inoperative descent and approach. The review they had just begun had been all but forgotten about. Even as McClelland worked through this checklist, he was continually interrupted by air traffic control, who were giving the plane descent clearances and heading instructions. In all of this activity, the pilots had allowed themselves to become overloaded with necessary, but nonetheless non-critical items, at a stage of the flight where it was crucial that they reviewed their highly consequential decision to shut down one of the engines. Finally, after multiple interruptions, the first officer managed to finish the single engine approach checklist. The aircraft was now prepared for an approach on one engine, and the pilots were mentally ready to carry it out. This was something they had practiced many times in the flight simulator, but this would be their first time carrying it out for real. The plane was now 15 nautical miles from touchdown and descending through an altitude of 6,500 feet. Captain Hunt began slowing the aircraft and asked for the first stage of flaps to be extended. Things in the cockpit had been busy for the past few minutes, but the aircraft itself appeared to be in good condition. Now, all of that was about to change. As the captain levelled off at 3,000 feet, he increased the thrust on engine number 1. Immediately, the vibration meter went to maximum deflection. But already convinced that they had shut down the correct engine, the pilots never thought to monitor it. The engine was now under tremendous stress. There was no guarantee that it would hold up until the plane touched down. As he lined up with the runway, Hunt began descending again and called for further stages of flap. The first officer extended the flaps to 15 degrees and lowered the landing gear, and Flight 92 began its final descent towards the runway. They now had less than 5 nautical miles to go until touchdown. With the flaps and gear extended, the aircraft was now experiencing much more drag than before. In order to keep his airspeed up, Captain Hunt had to further increase the power on engine number 1. But when he did this, the extreme vibrations returned. Flames began shooting out the back of the engine, and in the passenger cabin, the shaking was so bad that many of the overhead lockers opened, spewing their contents on top of the terrified passengers. The engine was sputtering, and its thrust output began to decrease. The captain pushed the throttle lever forwards, but this only made the problem worse. The engine was now tearing itself apart just miles from the airport. The runway, now tantalizingly close, began to slide up the pilot's windscreens. At just 900 feet above the ground, and still 2.5 miles from the runway, the left engine gave up entirely. There was a sickening feeling as the plane, now powerless, began to drop. Captain Hunt immediately ordered the first officer to start the right-hand engine, and McClellan frantically began trying to relight it. But there simply wasn't enough time. The plane would reach the ground before the right engine would have time to spool up. In a desperate attempt to stretch the glide, Hunt raised the plane's nose. But this had the opposite effect. It actually increased the drag on the plane and made its descent angle even steeper. With the plane slipping lower and lower, it now looked increasingly unlikely that the pilots would be able to make the runway. Bells and warning sounds erupted in the cockpit, with the ground proximity warning system alerting the pilots to their deviation from the glide slope, the fire warning for engine number 1 ringing out, and its red lights glowing in the centre pedestal. Looking out their windscreens at the runway, the pilots could clearly see that their situation was now unsalvageable. The captain quickly got on the intercom and told the passengers to prepare for a crash landing. As the aircraft's speed fell below 125 knots, the stick shaker joined the cacophony in the cockpit. It vibrated the pilot's controls violently, alerting them that the aircraft was about to stall. This shaking continued all the way down as the plane sunk and then slammed into the ground just short of the M1 motorway. It then bounced across the road and smashed into a wooded area on the other side of the motorway. The scene was one of utter devastation, with the aircraft breaking into 3 sections. 47 passengers died, and 66 more were seriously injured. 7 of the crew were also seriously injured, including both pilots. But what had caused the engine problems to begin with? And how could such an incredible response as shutting down the wrong engine be prevented from happening in the future? As a direct result of the crash, all 99 of the 737-400s in service were grounded. Analysis of the engines determined that the fan blades of the upgraded engine used on the 737-400 were subject to abnormal amounts of vibration when operating at high power settings above 10,000 feet. On Flight 92, this vibration had led to excessive metal fatigue, causing one of the fan blades to snap off during the climb to cruise altitude. This critically damaged the engine, and also upset the delicate balance of fuel and air, causing a reduction in power and an increase in vibration, which ultimately destroyed the engine when power was increased on final approach. As a result of the crash, the engines used in the 737-400 were redesigned so as to eliminate the vibration which caused metal fatigue. But the biggest changes which resulted from this accident were not in engine manufacture, but in pilot training. pilots now receive extensive training in crew resource management, or CRM, which includes the delivery of NITS briefings to cabin crew. Modern training also emphasises the need for pilots to carefully review every decision that is made, and to take as much time as is needed to do this safely, rather than to act quickly and make a false diagnosis. Training also teaches pilots to use automation to lighten their workload when appropriate. In this accident, Captain Hunt's decision to fly manually had diverted his attention away from identifying the problematic engine at a time when this was the most important thing for him to be focused on. In subsequent versions of the 737, like the 737NG and the 737 MAX, changes have been made to the way in which abnormal engine indications are displayed to the pilots. Colour coding and highlighting are used to draw pilots' attention to critical or malfunctioning parameters. After the accident, Captain Hunt and First Officer McClelland were dismissed, following criticisms of their actions in the final report. British Midlands later paid McClelland an out-of-court settlement for unfair dismissal, and Captain Hunt maintained that he and his fellow pilot were ousted because this was the easy option for the airline, rather than taking a hard look at their training practices and at systemic issues in the industry. Whatever way you want to apportion responsibility here, there is no denying that the impact of this accident on the aviation industry has been monumental. Flying is now safer as a result of the lessons learned from Flight 92. This video is dedicated to those who lost their lives so that these safety improvements could be made.